I think we are trying to do a very Indian thing, which is build a set of brands from India for the globe.
Zero capital and zero network. But you have the knowledge, the brain that you have right now. What would you do in 2024?
I would start a performance marketing agency.
How do you ensure that, you create a mafia like the Flipkart or the Myntras?
Meritocracy is important. We are here to win. For a startup, we need to win.
A need for a product or a service that if somebody offers you, you will definitely pay for him.
If somebody could look after aged parents as a service.
Tell me your favorite engine, because you always wanted to design engines.
Maybe the Ferrari Testarossa.
Do you also see a trend that social media, the folks who are very famous in social media will become politicians for tomorrow?
It could be, right? I mean, I think it's very possible. My sense is you have enormous reach.
Do you think population would be a problem for the planet?
I don't think so.
Why do you say so? What was the toughest cycle for you?
Spending time on making sure that however long you stay at Mensa, the big thing for me is it has to be the best learning of your life.
What is one feedback that you have received recently?
I can basically say,
What is India watching?
India is not a cheap market, it's a value market.
Is there anything that you really wish to do, but you're not getting time for it?
Listening to your podcast.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Shivank, and we are part of the 01 Network by Zerodha. Together, we intend to bring you insights from the top thinkers in the field of entrepreneurship, technology, and investing. If somebody wants to become a founder, right? What are some skill sets that he or she, the context is that what are some skill sets that...
For a founder? First, I think is actually most important is resilience. Okay. I think you go through good times and bad times. And I feel like I'm reasonably resilient. I've been through some tough cycles.
Right.
I've been through some very good cycles. So, just being resilient, I think is important. The second, I think, is energy and enthusiasm, right? I mean, I feel like I bring a lot of that to the table, hopefully.
Yes.
You ask the rest of the team. But, I think energy and enthusiasm is a big deal. I think you have to be the chief energy officer of the company, right? You have to sort of infuse energy. You have to sort of bring excitement to the problem, because there'll always be some problem, right? But you have to sort of look at the ability to sort of look beyond the current problem and say, here is where we're going, right? And I think creating that energy and excitement, I think is second. Third, I think, is actually problem solving. I mean, which is, it can be small, it can be large, but how do you actually help? Problem solving is a third. And if I can add a fourth, it is finding the right people for the right roles. I think it's an important skill as a founder. I think you don't have all the skill sets. You have to figure out who the person is that will solve your finance problems. You have to find the right person to solve. So there are different problems in your company.
Right.
Finding the right person to solve the right problem and putting that equation in place, I think, is another very important skill.
And how do you learn that? How do you find right people for a right role? What's the challenge there?
I think it's judgment, right? Because it's not data-based. You sort of have to judge the person and you have to judge the problem. And you have to say this person in this problem will be dramatically better than this person in the other problem, right? I have actually seen where, not at Mensa, but in some of my earlier companies, where taking a person from one context and putting them into a different context, you've transformed that person.
Okay.
Right? You've gone from, you had a person doing strategy work and you put them in operations and they've done dramatically better. They were not a strategy person, right?
Right.
So I think getting that right, takes some judgment and some thinking. I think most people are not really thoughtful about it. I don't think there is no method to it. I think I'm thinking out a lot. I think there is some method to it, but the biggest thing is actually being able to reflect on the strengths of the person. Being able to deeply think about the core skill sets needed to solve that particular problem and see if there's a match. And you don't spend enough time thinking about it, right? You sort of take status quo as a given. And making some changes actually helps go a long way.
You recently mentioned that you have been to so many cycles. A lot of them were tough cycles. What was the toughest cycle for you?
I think probably Medlife.
Okay. The fundraising part?
Not just fundraising, right? We went through, it was a new industry for me. So I went from sort of, e-commerce, fashion to healthcare. And healthcare actually has nuances. While some part of it is very e-commerce,
okay,
a lot of it is regulated. So I think understanding a new industry. We went through COVID immediately after it took over. And I think working with a team that is remote and disparate. 500 people spread out everywhere and managing that on a daily basis is non-trivial.
Okay.
And third is, I think, raising money. I mean, it was very tough to raise money, and then eventually we ended up selling to Pharmeasy.
Right.
And we went through a phase where we actually had very little money, right? We almost ran out of money. And I think managing with very limited cash flows was one of the best learning experiences in my life, because you quickly realize what's most important and what's not. And I think you also start to realize how cash really works, right?
Right. So what was your lowest point in life? And what was the best advice that you received at that time?
From a work standpoint, I would say, I think going before the Pharmeasy sale, I think maybe 5, 6 months, 10 months before, I think we were going through a very tough time at Medlife. And I think sticking through it, I think, fighting every day, right? Because essentially we could basically pay what we got the previous days.
Right.
You managed cash flows so minutely. And I think that was very, very, very difficult learning, right? Because you have to balance multiple things.
Right.
You have to decide who to pay, who not to pay, right? You have to sort of do all of those things. I think that was probably a very difficult time. The best advice I got was, I think one of my mentors told me that stay with it. I think, if you can manage this phase, things will improve. And you can't see it when you're at the low. And I think it did improve. COVID actually did help us because, demand increased.
Got it.
In the case of an e-pharmacy. And we were able to actually make it work. And then we sold quite successfully to Pharmeasy. So it sort of went through a journey.
You also mentioned that you have to be chief energy officer, right? How do you keep yourself energized? Because you have to always radiate. You can't, be slogging and you can't look like, I'm drained, right?
Yeah.
You have to give them energy. How do you keep yourself energized?
So firstly, going back a little bit, I think meditation helps. I think being centered helps.
Right.
Having some interest outside of work also helps because you sort of put life in perspective. I think these are the macros. I think within work, I'm very clear about some things give me energy, some things don't give me energy.
What are those?
So, for example, I like problem solving. I think it's generally, more difficult a problem, just getting into it, looking at the data, looking at multiple cuts, thinking about different areas, thinking about 5 different things to do, I think gives me a lot of energy. For example, a lot of process, which you need, right? I mean, in terms of streamlining a process or putting in place a process I don't particularly like. But I know I have to do it, right? So I sort of, through the day, figure out what gives me energy, what doesn't give me energy, and balance that out during the day.
Okay.
And I think that makes a big difference.
What do you fear the most? What are your fears, sir, in life?
I don't know. I mean, what?
Do you fear anything?
Of course, everybody has fears. Professionally, I would say becoming irrelevant is something that I worry about. I don't know why that is the case, but how do you continue to remain relevant? How do you continue to build an institution? How do you sort of be on top of it? I could have not done Mensa, but I chose to. And I think part of that is around being relevant. I think that's what also drives you. I think relevance is maybe not for me personally, but being relevant in the ecosystem, I think matters.
How do you ensure that you are relevant? Because you fear this, what do you do to...
I think by creating, right? The only way to remain relevant is by creating, at least in the startup ecosystem. And therefore, you have to keep creating. And I think, continuing to be at the cutting edge of what we do, continuing to be the best at what we do, I think really creates relevance over time. I think that's one. Second, I think is the way you get relevant is you solve difficult problems that actually help the entire ecosystem. Right? That is the other way to get relevant. So I think both are important. And I think you have to balance both out.
And in life, is there anything that you fear?
Not really.
You're fearless?
Not fearless, but I mean, there are not really, not particularly, right? Not really.
Got it. What's on your bucket list?
One would be to be a winemaker at some point.
Okay, really?
Yeah. I'd love to sort of create my own label and make a wine, create a brand.
Aren't you acquiring any brand under Mensa?
No. Mensa is very much into fashion, beauty, and home decor. So this, I think, would be a project maybe for much later. But I would love to be a winemaker.
Wow. Is there anything that you really wish to do, but you're not getting time for it in life?
Listening to your podcast.
Okay.
No, I'm just, but I'm saying really listening to more, I think learning more, reading more, I would love to do.
Okay.
I think, I limit it more or less to flights now. So I think, that if I had more time.
Got it.
I actually really like learning about new topics. And I've done less of it than I used to. Right? I used to read like a book every 10 days.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And now that's come down. So I still read a few books a week, a few books a month. But couple of books a month now, maybe.
Got it.
Right.
What is one thing that you're so contrarian about that you can't tweet about it?
I don't know. Don't know. I think that any opinion that I have, I can express it. I don't know whether Twitter is the medium of choice that I would have. Only because, by the way, Twitter has becomes a one-sided conversation. I think it's not a dialogue anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
But what's one thing that people often find you contrarian on?
I don't think I'm particularly contrarian about anything. I'm just trying to think about, if I go back, right, many people thought that fashion would never sell online. And I fundamentally believe that it would. And that sort of worked itself out. I mean, just at a macro level, right, I remember during the early Myntra days, the big question used to be, will people really buy fashion online? And how much will it actually go? And that's like I mean, just if you don't think about it now, but 10 years ago, that was a question.
Wow. Which is your favorite brand? And before that, not a Mensa brand, caveat.
Of consumer products?
Yeah. In all these three
in
categories.
fashion, beauty, and home?
Yes.
Which are not Mensa brands. I have not. I only use Mensa brands. I cannot not do Mensa brands. But if I looked at different price points, because Mensa doesn't operate in the luxury segment. I think in fashion, I love many of the LVMH brands.
Okay.
I love Hermes, not because of anything else, but I think they've done a fabulous job of product quality and marketing and creating supply-demand imbalance, right? Love it. I think they just, you have to wait in line to buy a bag, right? I mean, who does that? It's like superb. So I have a lot of respect for what they've done, I think, in sort of the fashion space. In the case of home, I love IKEA. I mean, it seems very obvious, but I love IKEA. I think just if you go to their store, you can spend hours and hours and hours. By the way, the brand that I love in fashion, which is more in our segment, I love Uniqlo.
Okay.
I think Uniqlo, just the variety, the price point to the variety equation. There's simplicity of design and lines. You can buy a fabulous winter jacket for $100, right? Which you can't do otherwise, right? Or, whatever, right? I love Uniqlo as a store. I think just the combination of variety at price point, at affordable price points, is superb.
Tell me, sir, who have you learned the most in your life from?
Yeah, I would say one is my father. I think from him, I learned a lot about planning, being methodical. I think, he was, till 10th grade, he was actually in a Tamil medium school.
Okay.
Then sort of went on in life, joined the railways, went up the ladder, retired as the CEO of Hindustan Motors, right? And so he's a big role model that I look up to because he's very planned, very methodical, very detail-oriented, very good with people. And I think those are interesting characteristics to absorb, right? And I think one of the other things that I liked is he never brought the stress home. He was managing complex businesses, difficult times, labor problems, unions, but at least at home, I never felt like there was any stress associated with running a large business. And I think that's something interesting to learn from.
What is your earliest memory of your father, sir?
We would get up and do math problems at 4:30 in the morning.
Really?
Really. So every day, 4:30 to 6 was the time that he and I would sit together and do math problems.
Which is your favorite startup?
Apart from Mensa, of course.
Yes, apart from Mensa.
Apart from Mensa, I would say, I think, look, what the folks at Zerodha have done is something truly inspiring, right? I mean, I don't know, it's no longer a startup, but, bootstrapped, market leader, large, profitable, I think fabulous in terms of what they built. And I think it's a role model for most of us, right?
If you have to go to dinner with a celebrity, don't take Deepika Padukone. Give me a name.
Maybe Barack Obama. Because I think, look, US president, I think first black president of the United States, it must have been such an interesting journey to get accepted, right? And sort of to make these big decisions and manage this large machinery. And I thought that would be very interesting, right? I mean, the first guy to have broken the sort of glass ceiling at the highest level, right?
Crazy.
Yeah. So I would say Barack Obama, I would be very excited to go have dinner.
Got it. This is interesting and I want you to take time for answering this. One day, let's say, you wake up with zero capital and zero network, but you have the knowledge, the brain that you have right now. What would you do?
It's a very good question.
You have all the knowledge, you have all the facts, you have the McKinsey mind, but you have zero capital and zero network. You don't know anyone.
Yeah.
Take your time. Please take your time.
Yeah. You're asking me, I generally take no time on questions. You're asking me good questions. What would I do? I would start a performance marketing agency.
Why will you start a performance marketing?
Because I think it's done badly today. And I don't think it requires capital. And I think it requires only knowledge. And performance marketing, when I don't mean just Google and Facebook. I also mean Amazon, Flipkart, Myntra, etc., right? How do you actually, traffic is now aggregated into some
Right.
3-4 areas. How do you take advantage of that is actually a real skill, right? It's what in Mensa we call growth hacking. And I think it's a very difficult skill. And if you have knowledge about it, I think you can build a real business around it.
Tell me 3 things about growth hacking that that comes to you after so much of experience.
Ads, visibility, and pricing. Look, in a mobile phone, the first 6 swipes matter, right? On any platform. The rest doesn't matter. The first 6 swipes are becoming more and more expensive because everybody needs to make money.
So how do you come to the first 6 swipes?
How do you come to the first 6 swipes? With the least amount of money.
How do you do that?
So I think one is you can do a little bit more programmatic ads. What I mean by that is, for example, and Amazon actually allows you API that allows for data and events to actually come all the time. So you can actually build software that actually allows you to optimize on the bids, decide on the minimum, decide on the maximum, check on where the budget is, and keep optimizing through the day. So I think building that, is could be very interesting.
Okay.
Second, I think is each platform. A Myntra values something different than an Amazon, than a Flipkart, than an Arghyam, right? Myntra, for example, values freshness, new, what's new. So how do you sort of decide that what do you do to make sure that you get free visibility? And how do you make the algorithms look at your brand differently, right? So for example, could you basically group and launch a bunch of new products together so that you keep getting tagged under what's new and your brand gets free visibility, right? And so on and so forth. So that's the visibility angle. And pricing, right? I mean, pricing plays a big role, and volume price elasticity is actually now mathematically calculatable because you have impressions, you have click-throughs, you have what's actually checked out, right? So based on that, you can actually build algorithms on pricing. I think all these 3, very few people do very well. And I think doing them well gives you a structural advantage.
Let's say that you have opened a successful performance marketing company and now you have a lot of wealth with you.
Yeah.
What would you do with those, let's say, a couple of 100 crores or 1,000 crores that you have accumulated?
Look, I'm very passionate about a few different things outside of work.
Which are?
One is, I think, mental health,
right,
especially with women and girl child, I think. So I think I would do some work there for sure. I'm doing some amount of work, but I would do more. And I think there's a massive problem in India, especially with teen girls. And I think it's something that I think you have to solve structurally. So I would definitely spend money and time behind it. So that would be one big thing to do.
Okay.
The second big thing I would do is maybe nobody's tackled tech and education, primary education, at least in any meaningful manner. It could be interesting to actually solve, not for profit, not create an edtech startup, but actually create a service, right? I mean, if you think about what UPI has done to payments, could there be some disruption like that in education? Would be another area that I would spend some real time thinking about.
Got it. Do you hire consultants in Myntra, Mensa?
For some particular problem, yes. So, I mean, if there is, for example, where we are assessing a new business, and you need to get up to speed on the business landscape, relative market sizes, etc., then of course, we use consultants, right? And I think firstly, it'll be a facetious not to say it, but I do think consultants add value. But I think the way they add value depends a lot on the client, right? If the client basically defines the problem clearly and keeps it sharp and focused, then I think consultants can add value because they bring pattern recognition, they bring external resources, right? So I think I define sharp, small problems and therefore use it. Do I hire ex-consultants? The answer is sure.
Got it. Makes sense. Do you hire only from McKinsey?
Not at all.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
The last question for this, tell me about some decisions in your life and business which has got some orbital shift in your life.
I think first was leaving McKinsey. It was not an obvious choice. I mean, I just made senior partner, and most people after making senior partner don't leave. And I was doing quite well at the firm. I think leaving to go to an operating role and running Myntra with relatively unknown people at that time, Sachin, Benny, Mukesh, was actually a big decision. And I think it changed the trajectory of what I do. I think McKinsey can be equally successful. And I think it's a very good firm. It's a great place to be. But I think what I'm doing now would never have happened if I didn't do Myntra. And that was a big, uncomfortable leap right? And I think it came with a risk and reward, right? It could
What was the risk then?
The risk is, Myntra could not have worked and you can't go back to McKinsey, right? So you left a career that you've spent 15 years building, right? And got into something completely unknown.
Got it. So, Myntra, recently, day before yesterday, I was attending a session with Mukesh sir, and he was telling us a very interesting thing I wanted to double click on. He said, we thought, we were talking about counterintuitive insights, and they said the return to origin was biggest problem in Myntra. And then we actually realized that the number of people who, give returns are actually spending more time and actually buying more, because if we are giving them successful returns, they're actually
return as a functionality in e-commerce. Yeah.
So how are you able to, how did you get the counter insight, and how are you able to then, leverage that insight?
No, I think...
do you get the context of what I...
Yeah, I get the context. It's not the most important problem at Myntra, but I would say, I think there are good returns and bad returns, right? People who return between 1 and 2 times actually have the highest lifetime value. So what you need to do is actually have bought and returned and had a good return experience once. Then you buy much, much more because you're more confident about the platform, right? So I think the ideal, if I remember, this is a long time ago, right? But the ideal return percentage in my mind is like a person who's returned 1.2 times or something like that, right? I think mathematically it was something to that effect. And I think that made the best consumers because you have the best lifetime value. If you don't return at all, you may be unhappy and never come back. So it's consumer churn. If you return too much, you cost too much money and you're using it, you're overusing the functionality. So you have to return the appropriate number of times and get enough confidence in the platform. The other thing, by the way, that I think was a big breakthrough at the Myntra level on returns was if you return twice through data science, you could figure out the right sizes for you. And therefore, the recommendation engine would prevent you from doing more returns by actually suggesting the right number. Right. I think that was also a very complex problem that got solved.
Got it. Tell me your first product at McKinsey, sir.
Yeah, the first project at McKinsey was for an auto company. I was actually working on design to cost, which is basically taking a component, an automatic shifter, steering wheel, right, whatever, a bumper, and figuring out how should you reduce the cost of that while maintaining the functionality. So it was a very engineering-driven project, right? Because you basically went through in detail, you built up a cost sheet, and you basically said, here are the benchmarks. You looked at different functionality. You interviewed a bunch of consumers. I think it was very interesting to sort of figure out what I actually still use it. Because, if you think about our current products at Mensa, in one of the advantages of having a house of brands as opposed to a single brand is you can do platforming and design to cost, right? So we buy all our fabric across 3 or 4 different fabrics for multiple brands. We buy all our trims together, right? And therefore, we're able to get the cost to be dramatically lower while still giving lots of variety. Same thing is true, by the way, in beauty, where you actually work with 2 formulators. You work with similar kinds of packaging, but different prints on top. So you can actually get economies of scale through packaging. So I still apply some of that today.
Wow, this was interesting. Tell me, what was the most challenging project in McKinsey? जिससे सबसे ज़्यादा learnings आपको आई थी?
One of the most difficult projects was we were working with a company that made different forms of glass shapes and forms for various industries. And the business was getting, the project that we were brought in to do was they were losing money, they wanted to make money, etc. And the conclusion that we came to was they were in the wrong business and they needed to actually shift. And I think leaving the core problem that we were given and focusing on the bigger problem, I think was a big leap of faith, right? And making sure that we went to the management and told them what we thought, which they did not at that point, and we actually ended up not working with them more. But I think it was the right answer, and eventually that business, they did change, but it happened multiple years later.
Wow. So tell me, is it okay to say that Mensa is inspired from the Therasio model in the States?
No, not actually. The origin story, I know, but I'm saying the origin story is quite different, right? So the origin story is the following. In Myntra, we built out Myntra fashion brands.
Right.
Which is Roadster, HRX, all of these, right? I think that was built out. After I finished Medlife, I was wondering what to do, right, in life. So actually, I brainstormed with a couple of colleagues and a couple of former colleagues and so on. And one of the ideas we came up with was, can we actually build a platform agnostic view of Myntra fashion brands? Because Myntra fashion brands was profitable. In the e-commerce world, it's very hard to be profitable. It was profitable. So could we build a private brand business but a brand business, but is not dependent on one platform. That's how the idea started. So the goal was always, by the way, how do we create a house of brands?
Okay.
And never an aggregator. And I'll tell you the difference between the two. The categories we've chosen, fashion, beauty, and home, are categories where the SKUs don't repeat, right? So you're not building a reviews and ratings mode. The real mode you're building is product development and sourcing, which is very much of a brand business,
right.
Number one. Number two is India is not an Amazon-dominated market. There's no one platform that dominates. You have Flipkart, Amazon. You have Nykaa, you have Myntra, you have Arghyam. Now you have quick commerce, which is really taken off. So all of these actually, so it's always a multi-channel thing. So that's very different from Trasio. Third is, I would say the biggest thing we're creating is brands. We own Men's XP and IDEVA, which are content platforms. The reason we own Men's XP and IDEVA is we use them to do brand building for cheap. And that's also very different because from day one, we've always wanted to build brands, right? So our goal, if you actually look outside the office, is, can we make some household names come out of 5, 6, 7 brands? We don't want to have 200 brands. We want to have 6 brands that become market leaders. So I think the idea is quite different. I think it's an India-specific problem, which is India in the fashion, beauty, and home space actually doesn't have many brands. 80% is unbranded, 20% is branded. Even in the 20% branded business, there are very few brands that are north of 1,000 crores. So the problem statement that we made actually very much was, can we create an iconic set of brands in a tech-led manner? Why tech-led? Because distribution is more democratic now. Right? You can, for 120 rupees, get to most pin codes in India. Second, you need tech in order to do growth hacking, which we spoke about earlier. Third is brand building is now more online than offline. And therefore, you need, again, a tech-led approach to do brand building. So that's the difference of what we're trying to do. And it's very easy in India to start something, very hard to scale something. And scaling requires different skills, different talent, different approach to brand building, different approach to tech, different approach to investments. So I think all these together sort of came together to say, what do we want to do? So I don't think it's Trasio. I think we are trying to do a very Indian thing, which is build a set of brands from India for the globe in these spaces, which actually don't have brands. I mean, I'll give you a few examples. 30% or something, I remember, maybe it's now 20, but used to get sourced, H&M gets sourced from India. Some 20+% of Pottery Barn gets sourced from India. Why don't we build Pottery Barn and H&M? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build brands by taking advantage of product development and sourcing from India, tech from India. And we want to sort of build it in India and around the world.
If, let's say, somebody was building a Harvard-level case study on Mensa, will this tech-led approach will be the sign-user for the case study? Or what aspect of the company?
I think they would do 2 aspects. One was actually brand building, which is how do you do brand building cost effectively online and offline? Second is how do you do growth hacking using tech online and offline? Third is how do you build a great people system where you have brand managers that act like CEOs and founders. These are the 3 things that people would talk about.
Got it. Tell me about the tech-led approach that you are telling. Tell me the most interesting aspect of technology, applications of technology.
I think the largest is data science, right? So, it's very hard to get price volume elasticity done if you don't have a data science model. So that's a classic problem. You have 10,000 SKUs. You have multiple channels, 6, 7 channels. You have to get price volume elasticity across all these channels, and you have to create an equation that basically predicts based on the past. That would not be possible without data science. That's a complex model to build. So that's one example of tech-led, right?
Give me other things also.
Another example of tech-led would be how do you optimize the marketing funnel, right? So how do you actually think about lookalikes? How do you sort of direct the right ads in Meta or Google or whatever to make sure that you get the maximum conversion and the maximum click-through rates? How do you personalize videos much, much more than what you're doing now? All of these are tech-led, right? So the entire marketing engine is now much more mathematical than it used to be. Of course, there's the creative side of what content you create, right? But then how do you distribute that? It's now become dramatically more math-led.
Also, at Myntra, you were able to predict कि कौन सा fashion कितना बिकेगा.
Which, by the way, we are doing now here also.
How do you do that?
So, I mean, it's not just fashion. It's also beauty ingredients. It's also home decor trends, etc. So, I think, look, firstly, you scrape a lot of data.
कहाँ से होता है ये data?
Instagram, Myntra, Aayog, Flipkart.
How do you scrape this data?
We built a custom scraper. So, you go look for, you go sort by what's new, what's trending, etc., and get the links, right? And scrape
Can you see what people are wearing? The famous people.
Not just famous people. I think what is the volume say, right? What's popular is done by volume in most of these platforms. Therefore, you get an automatic indication of what is trending. Based on that, and based on Instagram trends, you are able to come back and say, look, by the way, you don't predict a trend, just to be clear.
Okay.
What you predict, you don't predict a particular style. What you predict are trends. You basically say, look, A-line dresses will sell more, or kurtis will sell more. And within that, by the way, the following colors are trending. And then you give that as input into our designers, who then make products where the hit rates are better.
Any other interesting application of data science that you use?
No, I think I would say the other one is demand forecasting.
Okay.
Which is how do you predict how much to buy?
How do you do that?
So there again, I think it's really, two parts to the problem without getting too technical. The first is in fashion and beauty and home, the SKUs don't repeat.
Right.
So you need a clustering algorithm, which basically says this SKU is the closest to the historic SKU Y, right? Based on attributes, right? So, let's say a shirt has 5 attributes, a dress has 8 attributes. So you basically could say these attributes are similar. And therefore, by the way, you are able to use those attributes to say this SKU is similar to that SKU. Then you look at historic data, and then you make some judgment calls on what the forward-looking will look like in terms of demand and come up with a demand forecasting piece, which is also a complex problem.
Got it. And when you say you predict trendings, what are trendings on different platforms? Abhi sabse zyada inclination kahan par hai? What is India watching? What's the unique insight about the consumer that you are selling?
I think what's interesting for me is, look, Insta and YouTube are at the cutting edge of what things are, right? Nobody looks at Facebook anymore. But if you think about our audience, and I think it varies by segment. The 3 insights I would say first is there is not as much difference between tier 2, tier 3 and tier 1 anymore in terms of what
because
people
democratized
want. People want the same things, right? Which is quite interesting for me. People want the latest fashion in any segment or the latest ingredients in any segment. I think that's second. Second, I think not a very counterintuitive insight, but India is not a cheap market. It's a value market. They're very, very, very different things, right? Value is very different from being cheap. For me, I think that's the big thing. I think they want the thread count, or they want the right ingredients, or they want the better certification. They want more for this price point that they're selling. So that is the other big one that I think comes up. The third is, I think people actually think much more in communities now than they used to. So if you think about advertising, I think, and use of influencers, I think the more natural and organic it feels, the better off you are. So people trust what their friends say, what their community says, right? So one of the things we are doing, I think in Men's XP and IDWise, we have trusted communities, right? And those communities are great ways to have conversations. We have a brand called Trust Basket, which is a gardening brand. Gardening is very much of a community-driven thing. So the fact that Trust Basket has a voice in the important gardening communities that matters is the reason why Trust Basket sells. And that's a better way to advertise than to do a lot of campaigns, right?
Got it. So Mensa was one of the fastest unicorn. Why do you think was the case?
So look, firstly, by the way, valuation is a vanity metric. I don't think necessarily unicorn, non-unicorn, etc. matter. What matters as a founder is how much money do you need and how much dilution are you willing to take. These are the 2 things that matter. We actually are very fortunate to have a great set of investors. They believed in this team. They believed in the business that we're trying to build, and they believed in the brands. We also got to scale quite quickly, right? We're a 200 million run rate business in 3 years of operation, which was among the fastest of any company. So forget the valuation for a minute. The fact is we're building a great business, and we're building a great business that will last for, that can compound for another 20 years. That's what people believe, right? Because what are you trying to, what are you doing when you invest? You're basically saying, will the future cash flows be great? And based on the business that you're trying to build. Right? That's what people sort of saw in us. They're saying we're building in the space of consumer brands, very large TAM.
Right.
Second, good team that's done it before. Third, ability to make profitable business model. Fourth, building some interesting moats using marketing, branding, tech moats, growth hacking, blah, blah, blah. So I think those are the things that they saw and say, look, large space, large company to be built, large cash flows to be built, and that's why it's valued.
Also, you mentioned previously that while you were fundraising, under the Flipkart head, it was much easier, and then you were stuck to a challenge when you were trying to do that with Medlife. What did it teach you, sir?
So I think obviously in Myntra when it was under the Flipkart umbrella when we were raising, it was already a market leader. It was already a large company. I think being a market leader helps. Right? I think in Medlife it was harder because there were 4 players of equal size.
Right.
So it just gets harder, right? I think so. Being a clear market leader helps. Mensa, by the way, we are clearly a market leader, and therefore that helps. The second, I think, is it teaches you humility, right? I think it is important to be able to sort of understand where an investor is coming from, What are they looking for? And how do you actually tell the story for them? And I think that's the other big lesson that I think you learn through this.
Is there any story that taught you, is there any incident that happened during that fundraise which stuck to you?
I mean, one is, look, I mean, it teaches you like you have to knock on 100 doors in order to get one to say yes. Only thing that matters is the one that says yes. It doesn't matter what the other 99 are. Right? I think that's a lesson in itself, right? You have to keep at it and eventually something will crack.
What did the merger of Medlife taught you with Pharmeasy?
I think, by the way, industry structure matters. Consolidation helped Pharmeasy, consolidation helped Medlife. It became a market leader. Pharmeasy, the combined entity, became a market leader by order of magnitude. Economies of scale improved, right? Therefore, I think it was the right answer.
Okay.
I think having too many players competing for the same thing doesn't help. Therefore, actually having consolidation helps. Incidentally, Myntra buying Jabong was the same thing. It consolidated the industry. In this case, we were being actually acquired by Pharmeasy, which I think is okay.
Right.
So I think it is important to create clear industry leaders who can then go on to do great things. And I think that's what this did.
Got it. You're on the board of Marico, right?
I'm on the board of Marico, yeah.
What did it teach you?
So first, I think Harsh Mariwala is an outstanding entrepreneur. And I think what he's built over the last 20, 30 years is just incredible, right? If you think about the brands, etc. Saugata was a great CEO.
Right. Yeah.
For me, what I thought, by the way, is I think Marico is one of the best, I think the best examples that I've seen of how they use independent board members to add real value.
How do you do that?
They basically sort of make sure that the board has different capabilities, right? So maybe I bring digital capabilities, somebody else brings audit capabilities, somebody else brings M&A capabilities, and they put that group very well together. I think that really matters. Second is how the CEO, which is in the case Saugata, and the chairman, which is Harsh Mariwala, sort of conduct the meeting, which is to make sure that everybody's opinion is heard. Everybody's
Give me an example
viewpoints.
of that. How
So in a Marico board, I mean, I don't want to, it's a publicly listed board, so I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically making sure that, everybody's input is heard and it's done well and everybody's input, even outside of the board meeting in specific areas is taken in, leads to better decision making.
We are hosting Nikhil sir, okay, for a podcast. If you were to interview him, what would you ask?
I think he has an incredibly good ability. How does he keep learning new things? Right? I think he has a childlike curiosity about every topic. He approaches it from the basics. How does he do it?
This is a challenge that we are facing. And if we were to hire a consultant for this, give us some advice. Let's say you were to if you had to interview Deepika Padukone or Virat Kohli, and you were a 22-year-old person, how would you do that? And if you already hosted 106 entrepreneurs, really high reputed entrepreneurs, so you've cracked that entrepreneurial circle. But now you have to crack people who are in that industry.
Yeah.
How would you do that?
I don't know. I think you should find a common intersection of interests. Your audience needs to have some use. You have to I think in general, you have to find out what the other person wants and see if there is some part of that you can offer.
Tell me one thing which has shocked you recently in life or business.
I think, I don't know about shock, but the more the things change, the more they remain the same. I think people are the same. I mean, it's quite interesting. I've sort of now been in the startup ecosystem for 10 years. Right? Sort of seen up cycles, down cycles, up cycles, down cycles. And, it's quite predictable. People overreact in both, right? When there are down cycles, folks overreact. When there are up cycles, people overreact and get very, very excited. I think one of the things for me is just, I don't know if it's shocking or not, but I've sort of decided I've become more equanimous in terms of how I react to external events. And I think that's been interesting.
Tell me your favorite engine, because you always wanted to design engines, right?
Yes.
Which is your favorite engine?
Favorite engine is a great question. Not many people have asked me this. Maybe the Ferrari Testarossa, which is a V12 boxer engine. It's a very difficult engine to actually design in a very compact space.
Okay.
And the sound of that engine is like to die for. It's like a boxer engine. It's like no longer in production, and I don't do any fancy cars. So,
tell me, have you realized in the recent times a need for a product or a service that if somebody offers you, you will definitely pay for him?
One of the things I would say is, I think if somebody could look after aged parents as a service, I would pay for it. I think it's not productized enough. I think it's very variable. So, we all have aging parents, and I think aging relatives. And in fact, I was telling you a little bit earlier, but essentially we are the only next gen that's here. Most of my cousins, everybody's abroad.
Okay.
Right? So it would be great to have a professional service where you could actually get a community built for senior people as well as healthcare taken care of. There are many startups attempting it. I think nobody is doing it really well. And I think that would be, I think, quite an important service. I think that would be something investable.
And do you really need it? This is
Absolutely.
Okay, got it.
I need it because, I mean, I don't need it for myself. I need it for my family.
Of course.
Yeah, of course.
The one company which I can remember is Goodfellows. Have you heard about it?
I've heard of Goodfellows. I mean, of
done
course.
by Shantanu.
Yes. So Goodfellows is there. Then there is, of course, I mean, the original one was Portia, which did a lot of things. So there are many of these. But I would feel I think most people actually take care of old folks when something bad happens.
Right.
I think you need to actually build a community that actually is one step before and is preventive. And I think that is a very interesting value proposition.
So you were telling about the books that you were reading recently.
Yes.
Tell me a couple of more books that had huge impact on your life.
So, I mean, maybe 2 or 3. The one is, I mean, Hard Things About Hard Things. It's a very, very good one. In the same vein, I think 0 to 1 is a very good one as well. One of the best books I've read, which I think helped me with thinking, is Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, Daniel Kahneman. I think he's also one of my favorite authors.
Okay.
So
all these 3 books you have already recommended on some other show. Give me 3 new ones.
They are actually my favorite books. What else would I recommend?
Any recent book that you have given to your children to read?
Yes, I think Psychology of Money. I just read that recently. I thought it was quite interesting. I gave it to my kids to say, I think it's worth reading.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's about mindset, right? So I thought that was an interesting book.
Okay. There is a new book by the same author, Same as Ever. I've just started it. It's an amazing book.
Okay.
Of course. Any movie that you have recently watched which was worth your time?
I actually enjoyed Article 370. I thought it was I thought it would be more of a drama movie. But I actually thought it was very well made, and I thought it held my attention all through.
You come out, deeply thinking about
this, right? I mean, and there are so many sides to that problem, right? Which is quite complicated.
Do you have any solution for that problem? Because you are a problem solver.
I think the only eventual solution to any of these conflicts is education and economic upliftment, right? I was recently in Srinagar for some meeting, and I was actually in a cab, and I was asking my cab driver, saying, what did he think of it? He said, look, he used to run 3 cars. Now he runs 6. And for him, life has improved, right? So I think long term, if you can create economic incentives where people's lives are better, right? I think many, many problems get solved, right? Likewise, I do think education, which is being informed of all sides of the problem, really do help. Right. So for me, I mean, the macro level I'm no pundit on Jammu and Kashmir, but I think if you think about J&K and what needs to happen, I think economic upliftment and education will help dramatically.
Makes sense. You just mentioned 0 to 1. One thing he says that, try to predict future and then try to reverse engineer. So what are your thesis about future? Have you thought about it?
I think it's a very broad question. And I think it's very hard to answer. In my old McKinsey days, you could come up with 3 things that actually sort of did it. But if I sort of step back a little bit, I do think there are 2 or 3 macro trends that I think are going to change life. One is, I think we're going to live longer, right? I think through a combination of better focus on health plus advances in science, I think the average age has continued to go up, right, by 2 or 3 years every year, right? So, and that, by the way, creates a very interesting macro level problem, because you will suddenly have an aging population over time. I mean, India is a rare exception, but most other countries it's happened. And that will be a trend for the next 50 years. So I think it'll create a bunch of interesting socio-economic and social dynamics around communities, around how you take care of them, etc. And I think that's a macro trend thing. So this will have I think there will be some large industries that get built around this, right? So this is one. I think the second is, look, every generation there's productivity improvement. There's a lot of hype about AI. I think in my mind, AI, I think, will lead to productivity improvement of some kind, right? Some basic tasks you don't need to do so. If you take Mensa, for example, we're doing a lot of stuff on cataloging. We're doing a lot of stuff on, pricing. We're doing a lot of stuff on actually coding. Pricing prediction, but also coding, right? Just basic app coding, I think can start to be done much better.
Right.
I think all of these things, if you just abstract up a little bit, I think there is an opportunity to say, can we as human beings spend more time on value-added things, right? I mean, it can be leisure, It can be social causes that you really want to do. It can be around business, but around more critical decision making as the more mundane stuff gets automated, right? So I think productivity improvement, right, through tech, I think is a macro trend that I think will actually play a big role. And I think that's I think a good thing. I mean, I'm one of the believers that I think it's a good thing, because I think the more time you free up, the more things you will figure out to do with your time. And I think it'll improve quality of life. Right? It's happened every time, right? In industrial revolution, to the computer, to wherever else. I think this will continue to happen. So I think this is the other big trend I think will change. I don't know if it's looking around, but I think this is clearly there, right? And I think you can sort of see that happen. I think the third is, look, I mean, at some level, if you look at politics and social media, I think that's also very interesting to see how you think of Meta as a country. Do you think of, I mean, it's 2 billion people, right? If you think about boundaries that change, and if you think about social media and the advent of social media, I don't mean this in a very trivial manner, but I think, for example, I was just chatting with my daughter who's in college today, right? I think the one big difference, if you think about Israel-Palestine and the protests that are happening, is social media is a big difference, right? It's not like Vietnam War, people didn't protest, but they were more isolated protests. It was harder to coordinate. Because also, you didn't have any institutional memory. 10 years later, everything is forgotten.
Right.
Now it lives on forever. So I think there are interesting implications also around, I think, what politics plus social media, etc., will do, and how that will actually have an influence on governance, right?
Wow.
So this is the third. Sorry, I'm just going a little bit randomly, but I'm just thinking about what these could be.
Do you also see a trend that social media, the folks who are very famous in social media will become politicians for tomorrow?
It could be, right? I mean, I think it's very possible. My sense is you have enormous reach. You have enormous influence. Can you translate digital too?
Actually getting local, physical, makes sense. Also, as we age, right, and as the productivity factor increases, do you think population would be a problem for the planet?
I don't think so.
Why do you say so?
I think because of the second effect of productivity improvement. I think we will get more effective and efficient in terms of how we live. I think, look, climate change is a real problem. I think overpopulation is a real problem, but it is slowing down, right? If you look at the trajectory, it's getting better. I'm a big believer. I don't know if you've read Factfulness. It's an orange book. It's well worth reading.
Okay.
Because I think if you take a little bit of a longer term view to facts, I think while bad news sells,
right,
actually, by the way, most metrics have started to improve. Right? Infant mortality is improved, healthcare is improved. Climate change, by the way, at least people are now more aware and are starting to do things about it. So I think over time, I don't think there will be, us as a species, right? Are we going to devour the planet by actually growing and growing and growing? I don't think so. I think we'll figure out means and ways to feed ourselves and means and ways to keep the environment better and safer.
Makes sense.
I'm a big believer in sort of human ingenuity, right? I mean, I think we'll solve problems.
Of course. Just like, I clearly remember when I was in class 7th or 8th, people used to talk about that ozone hole that's been there.
Yes.
But eventually we were able to curb that.
We were.
And we thought it would be a bigger problem, but all the CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, they curbed and all these.
Of course. So I think my own sense is we'll figure out better solves.
Makes sense. What are you teaching your kids?
I think, look, firstly, by the way, my kids teach me a lot more than I teach them. I think that's the sort of one big important thing to realize. I think, every generation actually is quite smart and gets smarter. And I think you realize how aware they are and how current they are, right? I mean, if I was as smart as my daughter is at 18 or 16 or 14, I think we're in a very different spot. At those times, I had no idea. So, I would say, look, my wife and I both try very hard to say we'll teach them some values, because I think everything else you can sort of, you sort of learn on your own and you figure it out for yourself. But I think values are important. I think respect for people, at least for me, I think living within your means and being frugal, I think matters. I think like a few different things, right, that we try and teach our kids, I think, from a value standpoint. So community, the importance of community. Right. So, and the importance for standing up for what you believe.
Okay.
So all of that, I think, are the things that we actually try and teach our kids. But I don't think we do it in a very conscious manner. I think kids absorb by looking at how they see around them. I think what you tell them is actually less material
than
what you do matters more. Because people judge you by what you do, not necessarily what you say. So I think that's what we hope to teach our kids. I don't know how much they've learned, but I think...
But what do you often find yourself, telling? them?
I mean, we have a lot of conversations dinner time about sort of what we're trying to build at Mensa, or there are multiple causes that are quite, close to both my wife Sandhya and I, right? We do stuff on mental health,
Okay.
A few other areas, but we speak about that. And I think the more you speak about that, I think the more kids absorb.
Got it.
Yeah.
And what did you learn from them? Because you said, you more.
I think one is,
What have you recently learned from your kids?
what have I recently learned?
Take your time.
So I think one is, look, I mean, standing up for yourself. My daughter just went through this entire Colombia episode. There's a big sort of protest that's happening on Israel-Palestine. And I was very impressed, I mean, at her maturity of being able to have a point of view, but not being fully in the conflict. Saying my voice matters. I'm going to tell people what I believe, but I don't necessarily need to go out and prove myself and have peer pressure to go protest in some way, right? So I thought it was very well done. And I thought that level of maturity was great. From my middle daughter, Shreya, I think I'm sort of getting a lot of things around. I mean, she's a big believer in the intersection. She's sort of thinking of doing science, engineering, and language.
This is lovely.
Which I thought was just such an interesting combination, right? I think, and from my youngest, I think just enthusiasm, right? And just zest for life. I mean, it's just interesting, I think, when you're young. And I think this ability to be energized by the day-to-day and living life to the fullest every day, I think is fabulous, right?
You learn from kids.
You learn from kids.
Tell me, what are certain things that gives you real happiness in life?
Very deep question. But I would say the obvious and most important one is family, I think, right?
Right.
I think spending time with my wife and kids and dogs, I think is probably what leads to the most amount of happiness. I would say the second is community.
Okay.
I think we have a good set of friends. And I think sometimes that is underrated. See, if you take 20 years ago when I was growing up, most of your community was family. I mean, you didn't have that many sort of friends because I think families also lived much closer together and so on, right? Now, my parents live in Chennai, my sister lives in Boston, my nieces live in somewhere else and so on, right? I think everybody lives everywhere. So I think having a great set of friends and a community, I think helps. So I think that's the other thing that gives me a lot of happiness. The third, frankly, is building Mensa. It gives me a lot of happiness. I think I'm very much about building things that I think last dramatically beyond you, which is what I hope, institutions, which is what I hope Mensa becomes. I think it's early days, it's 3 years in, but I genuinely feel like we're building something special. There are two parts to what you build. Always, one is a business part and the other is the people and culture part. And I think both are quite special. And I think that's what you remember eventually, right? You remember basically saying, are there a few brands that become household names? And have you made a difference to the life of a few hundred to a few thousand people? And I think that's what we're trying to do. And that gives me a lot of happiness, actually.
How do you build institutions, sir? If there is someone, a 22-year-old, and he's fascinated by the idea of creating something which will last him or her, how do you go about building institutions?
So I think there are 3 parts to institution building. The first is, I think you have to have it can be non-profit, it can be a company. You have to have an economic model that ensures longevity.
Sustainability?
Yeah, longevity.
Okay.
More than sustainability. I think you have to just last.
Difference?
When you say sustainability, I think there are many different forms. I don't know what you meant by sustainability.
Economic sustainability.
Yeah, that's what I meant as well.
Right.
Economic sustainability is what I meant as well. Longevity is, you need an economic model that allows the institution to last for a long time. Because the longer you last, the more you become an institution. I mean, it seems kind of obvious, but it's important. That's number one. Number 2, I think, is you need to have a purpose that is beyond the immediate. And what do I mean by that? I think there is, of course, pressures every quarter, every year to deliver on a number,
right,
to make economic surplus or to have some impact in terms of KPIs. But you have to have a purpose that is slightly more elevated, right? I think that's the second thing. The third is institutions are made by people. Institutions are never made by one person, right? So you have to sort of build people in the institution that care about it. I think McKinsey does a fabulous job of that. I think I would say even the Myntra Flipkart ecosystem has produced an institution, right? I think it is important to sort of have a set of people that feel proud to be alums. Because that also propagates the institution. And of course, by the way, proud to be in the company, right? But even as you leave, you sort of go out and do better and bigger things, right? So I think these are the 3: an economic model that allows longevity, a purpose that is beyond immediate, and I think having a set of people that I think creates a truly unique culture that you feel very special. I think these are the three. I think we're very early stages on all three in Mensa, but I think we're making progress on all three. And I feel very good about the fact that we'll build an institution that lasts for decades, right?
So I genuinely love the way you answer things in three, ways. That's coming from McKinsey. But let's dive deeper, right? So tell me about let's start with the middle one. How were you able to find a purpose which stayed for a longer time?
So I'll answer in Mensa and then in my life in two different parts, right? I think, look, Mensa is very simple. Can we create a few brands that become household names that can genuinely add value to consumers, right? I mean, if you look at what our purpose is, build a global tech-led house of brands, right? That's what we're trying to do. Global is important, tech-led is important, brands are important. And then if you look at our values, consumer focus and being in the top decile of consumer experience really matters, right? For each of our brands. So I think for an institution, creating something that somebody from a warehouse manager to an engineer, to a brand strategist, to a brand P&L owner, all can relate to, I think is important. And I think this is look, I want everybody at Mensa. So one of the jokes going around is whenever I see anybody at Mensa, I find out what they're wearing. And if it's not a Mensa brand, I find out why they're not wearing a Mensa brand. And why don't they wear DL or Hyster or Rubber Home, and sort of go through that, right? And the reason I do that is you have to love the products. You have to obsess about products, right? Because eventually in Mensa, we're a brands business. Brands, we're selling products.
Right.
You have to obsess about product quality. You have to obsess about how it feels. You have to obsess about how it looks. You have to look at the packaging. And that cannot come from one person. It has to be a shared thing, right? So how do you build product obsession at Mensa? And I think adds sort of purpose to it, right? So I think that's what we're trying to do at Mensa, right? And I think people get very excited by it, right? I mean, the test that I have is, would you recommend this to your family or friends? And if you're not an ambassador to your friend, if you're not constantly selling, whatever your brand is that you're working on, then you're not obsessed about it and you don't believe in it, right? I think that's a simple test, right? Of whether actually it exists or doesn't exist. So I would argue if you go and talk to people outside, almost all of them will at least be wearing one Mensa brand, and almost all of them will be at least promoting 1 to 2 brands, right? And I think that's a great way to sort of say, am I building a culture? You have to really believe it, right? And I think you believe it by first, belief doesn't come automatically. Belief comes over time. But to get over the first hump, you have to sort of make that leap of faith and say, I'm going to love my product. Because your products may not be perfect, but you love them. What you do with that then is you keep constantly giving feedback to make the product better. And over time, it becomes better. So that's a little bit of this thing about, creating a purpose and sort of getting a large group of people to believe in that purpose and obsessing about something.
Got it. The first one, how do you achieve longevity in an institution? And how are you trying? What are some couple of ways that you have thought for?
Yeah. So I think the biggest is just an economic model, right? I think, look, you have to create real profits. You have to create real cash flows. I think eventually the only thing that matters is cash flow, right? So I think we've been sort of focused on how do we create free cash flow, right? Which means, do you generate enough cash on a monthly level to fund not just your profit or loss, but also your working capital, right? Because that's how you grow, right? I mean, you have to invest in something and reinvest and keep growing, right? And I think, how do we get there quickly, right? And quickly can be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but it has to be there, right? And I think you have to sort of make that happen. I think that's very, very, very important. The way you think about how to make that happen, at least for me in the business context, it's different for non-profits, but in the business context is what I call unit economics, right? I think unit economics is important. In any tech-led business, if you can't make unit economics work, scale doesn't work. So we've been very, 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 very focused on unit economics. Every brand of ours is unit economics positive. Actually, by the way, now every brand of ours is EBITDA positive.
Okay.
And the overall level at the Mensa level, we're not EBITDA positive, but we're getting close, right? And I think we get to EBITDA break even, then we make more EBITDA, right? And I think this is important as we think about how do we actually build this. So that's a bit of what I mean by creating an institution, right? If you don't have that model, then you're constantly looking outside to see whether you can bring capital, get capital, make the business model work. I think, by the way, getting external capital is a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing because you get to some places faster, you're able to invest more, you're able to invest in tech, you're able to invest in people. But the base unit economics really needs to work.
Why do you think businesses struggle to get to that unit positive?
I think you sometimes forget scale and unit economics are not the same thing.
Okay.
Right? I mean, because we're in a hurry many times, without solving unit economics, you try and solve scale or you do it simultaneously. And I think that always leads to problems.
And the third thing, the people and the cultural aspect of the institution.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that, you create a mafia like the Flipkart or the Myntras of the world?
Yeah, so I would say, again, you may make fun of the threes, but there are three things that are important. But
Please.
The first, I think, is how you're actually interviewed and how you're inducted into the place. That experience leaves a mark. Because look, you may interview 100 people and take 2, but the other 98
Will go with that.
will go with that reputation. So making sure that when you get someone into the process, that is done in a very humane manner and in a manner where the values of the institution come through, I think is very important.
Give me an example of doing this.
So for example, when we do interviews at Mensa, right, we, independent of whether we take somebody or not, we actually make sure that there is a feedback loop that gets closed. By definition, you can't hire everybody, right?
Right.
But giving constructive feedback on what worked, what didn't work is a very simple thing, but most people don't do it. Right? If you reject somebody, right, you will usually just let the HR person know that you're not selected.
Right.
More or less, that's what happens. We actually add the little bit of extra step where we say, look, we really like the following 3 things. We were looking for slightly different. Here are the 3 things. Here are some observations. And I hope that's helpful for you. And we'll continue to stay in touch. It seems a very small thing, but it makes a big difference, right? It makes a difference to the candidate experience. And therefore, by the way, it leaves a reputation. So
Which compounds.
Which compounds, right? Yeah, reputations do compound. So, so this is one. The second is one of our values at Mensa is something called caring meritocracy.
Okay.
It's been borrowed. I mean, it's not our own. I mean, but it's very much, we have sort of made it our own.
Borrowed from?
Borrowed from McKinsey. Originally, McKinsey created this, but I mean, it's a slightly different context, consulting institution, etc. Right? But I think the reason why it's important is both words are quite important. Meritocracy is important. We are here to win. We're a startup, we need to win, right? So it is a sports team. It's not a family, right? I mean, so performance matters. And I think we should be aware of it. I think there are revenue targets to meet, there are EBITDA targets to meet, there are new product launches to do. So we're a meritocracy, right? And I think we value competence. We encourage and differentiate on performance. The reason I think it's interesting is we added the word caring. What that means is if you have a great interview process, you've got a lot of people in. Now, they've gone through a rigorous process, they've gotten in. Now, some people may fit in, some people may not fit in. How do you deal with that? How do you give constructive feedback? How do you make sure that, if somebody, it's not working out for somebody, how do you coach them? How do you give it enough time? That's what the caring part is, right? I mean, you can either be brutal or you can actually care about how the person feels. By the way, when people leave Mensa, right? Some people do, many people stay. How they leave, I think also matters, right? So when you're at Mensa, how do you give feedback? How do you improve the person on an ongoing basis? We basically spend a lot of time, right? We just went through a review process. We basically think like, look, I mean, how do I give real feedback? For our top 60 people, we do 360-degree feedback.
Okay.
So that, you get a little bit of a view on how you're being perceived by your peers, by people who work with you, by people who work for you, all of that, right? And I think that's an important aspect of how you do this. So spending time on making sure that however long you stay at Mensa, the big thing for me is it has to be the best learning of your life. That's how you create a mafia. You remember fondly of the times when you've learned the most. Why do people actually think about a Myntra or a McKinsey, right? Because you learned a tremendous amount in the time that you were there. What we're ensuring at Mensa is however long you stay, and I hope people stay for a long period of time, but whether you stay for 2 years or whether you stay for 10 years, this should be the best learning experience of your life, right? So this is the second part that I think is important. The third is how you exit people. And how do you make sure you deal with your alumni, right? Because your alumni network will grow. Do you stay in touch with them? Do you celebrate them? I mean, I, for example, still organize a McKinsey alumni party that I do in Bangalore, not every year, but every other year. I do the same thing with Myntra, right? And I think with Mensa as well, we actually constantly stay in touch with alums, right? And the alums go and are successful in other places and they help you.
Right, of course.
Right? So I think all these 3 things matter. Just to summarize a little bit, right? How you interview people, and especially the people that you don't take, how do you deal with them?
Right.
Second is, how do you make sure that Mensa is the best learning experience of your life? And third is, how do you treat your alumni and make sure that they land in good opportunities? I think all 3 are important for point number 3, which is culture.
I really agree to the third point because we happened to interview Shrikant sir, who runs this company called Fractal AI. He was telling me one of the biggest contracts that they had was because of one of his employee, because he went to other institution and then he actually convinced to give it to the Fractal. So
it really plays out, right? It really plays out because I think if you have a competent set of people that you've hired,
Right.
the hypothesis is that they will all do well in life, right?
Got it. Also, tell me what generally comes between a meritocracy-driven culture. What stops meritocracy?
We're all human. We want to be liked,
Right.
right? It's very hard to give difficult feedback. In a meritocracy, by definition, there are some people that will not do well. You have to give them difficult feedback. It's very hard to give difficult feedback, right? When you work with the person every day, you've gone through tough times. There's a lot of context on why something may or may not have worked.
Right.
But yet, you have to give them that difficult feedback. That's difficult to do, right? But you have to sort of philosophically get to the realization that giving that tough feedback is actually helpful to that person. And you have to convince yourself of that because it's quite uncomfortable for you. Giving something difficult to somebody,
It's painful.
it's painful, right? And so I think getting to a culture where it is important to say, look, I'm doing this because one, of course, it's good for me and for Mensa, but it's also good for the person receiving it. And I think that's important.
Got it. What was the toughest feedback you gave to someone? And what is one feedback that you have received recently?
So the toughest feedback, I think there have been many, but I think telling a high-performing colleague, right? Or, I've had a high-performing colleague who's actually not very good with people, right? And I think telling them that and pushing them to get better, I think it was very tough, right? It would have been easy for me because the business is performing quite well, right? To avoid this entire people thing. Right? Because, it's okay, right? I mean, business is receiving numbers, etc. But I think making sure that you go deep and give them the feedback to improve that person, I think that was tough to do, right? And I think, so that was one. What feedback have I received recently? I think, look, one of the things that we keep thinking about and balancing, and again, I've used this analogy a little before, but, microscope, telescope, right? I think one of the best ways it's difficult to have a run a successful business. You need a microscope in one eye and a telescope in another eye.
Right.
And many times when you do that, it gives you a headache, right? So, the reality is, I think one of the feedbacks that I've gotten is how do you balance the two, right? I mean, how do you make sure this quarter's number happen while trying to build for 3-4 quarters later, right?
Okay.
And balancing the two is not easy.
Got it. Because you're talking about feedback, which is very important, what's the right way of giving feedback?
First is, I think it's the tonality. I think the tonality needs to be one of empathy and not one of accusation.
Which is very, very important.
It's very important, right? I mean, I can basically say, oh, you right? And I think, literally the way you start, right? Nobody remembers the second sentence because you've gotten to fight off like mode, right?
Right.
And you're saying either, by the way, you want to leave or you're saying this guy's an idiot. Right? I mean, both of those are not helpful. So doing it with empathy, I think is probably the most important skill in giving feedback, which is tonality and empathy, I think needs to come through.
Got it. This was insightful. Tell me, how did you meet the most important person in your life?
I met her in school. The most important person in my life is my wife, right? Is Sandhya. So I met her in high school.
Okay.
And, we started going out much later, but, she's by far the most important person that I've met in my life.
So how did you convert meeting someone into marrying someone?
It's a long story, maybe not for this particular podcast, but it took me 6 years to actually convince her, but eventually I ended up convincing her.
What was the challenge for 6 years? And how were you able to finally crack that?
I think it just that I think, we were in different geographies, we were in different places. We all had different, we were going out with different people.
Okay.
So, I think eventually it took me a lot of time, but I convinced her.
Of course. Makes sense. What's your skincare routine? This was not my question, but I really...
Yeah.
Do you have any skincare routine?
Well, I mean, I have multiple brands.
Okay.
So I have to promote my brands. So Botanic Earth face wash is what I use. And Botanic Earth body wash is what I use. But I think it's clean and hydrate. I think literally. So, and both those products are available in Botanic Earth and they're terrific brands. So that's what I do.
As an entire Nikhil's show, I really liked your habit, So now also earlier we were very hesitant of when you are on the roads. You never used to tell कि हम क्या करते हैं, लेकिन अब जैसे, while we are running the show, कोई भी मिलता है ना, तो we find places to plug your channel in. So I really like the way that you did it on, Nikhil's channel. So good.
But I also, by the way, believe in the products. So it's not just that I plug my products. I genuinely think they were great products.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Which is your favorite wine, sir?
we could again have an entire podcast about wine. There is occasion drinking wine, which means you're opening it out for a special occasion, for a celebration, etc. And then there is regular wine that you can drink. And I think there are, the choices are quite different.
Okay.
Right? For a regular wine, I find a wine called Alma Viva.
Okay.
Very interesting. For an occasion wine, I love Burgundy.
Okay.
Burgundy is in France and makes only 2 grapes. One is Pinot Noir and the other is Chardonnay. So Burgundy grows both.
Okay.
Right? So you could have a red Burgundy and you could have a white Burgundy. A red Burgundy will be Pinot Noir and a white Burgundy will be Chardonnay. And I think it's a very small strip of land, but it is so complex that every 50 meters or 100 meters, the taste of the wine, the same grape grown in a different soil, tastes differently.
Why does it happen?
Because
the soil is consistent, right?
No, soil is not. That's why it happens.
Why?
I think because I think of history. I think this used to be under the ocean at some point of time, and it's now come on land. And therefore, every 50 meters or 100 meters, geologically, it's very, very different. And therefore, it makes very, very different wine. So I love Burgundy. So I like Burgundy but it's not but Burgundy is expensive and it's hard to find.
Okay.
So it's maybe for an occasion.
When did you had your first wine?
Actually, by the way, it's a very interesting story because I grew up drinking no wine, right? I mean, I grew up in Chennai, right? There was not that much. So I think my first one was in McKinsey and I was staffed in San Francisco.
Okay.
It's actually, by the way, a client of mine who took me out for a great bottle of wine.
Okay.
Right? He was a French guy, French Senegalese guy who took me out for a wine. And I think that's when I first got into wine drinking.
And uske baad, how did it stay with you?
So I enjoyed it. See, wine is a complex drink, right? Because you have multiple variables that can make the drink, right? It's the grape, it's the region, it's the year that it's made. So the number of variables are much higher than a regular drink, like whiskey or whatever. So I really liked it. And then it sort of grew on me. And I think, I sort of kept learning more, drinking a little bit, finding friends who did. And sort of it just
Is there a community around wine?
Absolutely. There's a fantastic community here in Bangalore.
Okay.
It's called the Wine Connoisseurs Club. Just started by a couple of friends of mine, and it's a fantastic club, and we meet every month.
So how do you get entry to the only people who like wine?
No, I mean anybody who's interested in wine can apply. I think there's a committee that sort of lets people in and not. And there's about 20-30 of us. And we meet, I mean, not everybody comes for every meeting, but about 15 people meet every month. And we talk about different wines. We learn about different wines. So this coming month, by the way, there's a wine event that's happening, which is hosted by a friend of mine called Shobha. And she basically will do an interesting wine evening with a different set of Pinots. And you learn from different regions.
Wow.
So you pick a theme and you learn about it.
Also, boss, tell me, that the vault which is storing 3,000 wines, whom are you storing it for? Why are you doing that and how to do that?
Firstly, wine collecting, like any collecting, makes no rational sense. I'm never going to be able to drink 3,000 bottles of wine, right? You need to drink every day, I think, for a long period of time, and then you still don't finish it. So I started collecting because I felt like it was an interesting hobby to have. And I think over time, I've now stopped buying too much.
Okay.
Right? Because I mean, even the 3,000 I won't consume. I don't know. Maybe my kids will like it. If they don't like it, maybe I'll sell it. Who knows? I mean, I think it's good. For now, I use it mostly for enjoyment. I keep saying it's an investment, but my wife keeps saying it's an expense because every time I drink it, there's no investment anymore left. So, but it's a great hobby to have.
Are the children acquiring the taste of the wine?
They're 18 at this point, so maybe not yet, but hopefully soon.
And how do you store that and where do you store that?
Stored in Chicago.
Okay.
I rent out a wine cellar. In the US, you can rent a wine cellar and it's sort of and store it, and it's temperature and humidity controlled and so on.
I see. Got it. This was a very interesting one.
Yeah.
Thanks a ton.
Thank you.
2 pages और थे, लेकिन I would be respectful.
No, I think.
Thanks a ton for your time and really grateful.